Hello listeners, this talk is about the Adam Goodes affair. Now the Adam Goodes affair is something that may not initially appear to be very relevant or interesting to people outside of Australia because it's very specific to Australia. However, I believe there are some general points that can be drawn from this, and I hope that you'll bear with me with this talk so that you'll see what those general points are and that they'll be interesting for you. So let me give you some background on this whole affair. Adam Goodes is an AFL player. AFL stands for Australian Football League, and it's the sporting league concerned with what's called Australian rules football. That's not rugby, that's a different thing. It's a very peculiar sport played in Australia, and it's very popular in Australia. So he's a player in that league. He's an Aborigine, an Australian Aborigine. Now he's quite a good player. He's quite famous and skillful. He won an award called the Brownlow Medal, which is basically for the best and fairest player. So the player who has a lot of skill and also who hasn't committed any fouls, essentially, that would require him to be suspended from playing for at least 1 week. And he won that award. It's a very coveted award in both 2003 and 2006. And he also won the Australian of the Year award in 2014, so last year. And that award is presented every year to one person, and it's basically someone who has done something for Australia. So sometimes it's doctors, or it could be people who've done a lot of community work. Occasionally it can be people in the arts. So he won that for his services to sport and also for the work he has done with Aboriginal communities. I actually don't think that the Australian of the Year award should go to anyone who is either involved in sport, because I don't really think sport's that important. I think someone who's invented a new medical device should probably get it over a sportsman. And I certainly don't think it should go to anyone who is vaguely involved in anything political. And the whole issue about Aborigines in Australia is a very political issue. Nevertheless, he received that award. Now, the actual affair, let me go into this. In 2013, he had a 13-year-old girl who was a supporter of another team. He plays for the Sydney Swans. He had a 13-year-old girl who was from a supporter for another team thrown out of a match. She called him an ape, apparently, and she later claimed that she didn't know that was a racist term. I mean, I still don't think it's a racist term to call someone an ape, but supposedly it is. And he called security over and had her thrown out of the match. So that was the first thing that he did that has turned a lot of people against him. Apparently also he has been accused of playing to the referee for free kicks. So he sort of is, maybe he should play soccer or something, because he's a bit of a sissy in that regard as well. And so people have been booing him at matches. People from other clubs, supporters from other clubs, have been booing him at matches since 2013 with that girl, and also because of how he plays. And I think also because some people think that he's too political. He's brought a lot of politics into the sport that people didn't want involved in the sport. They wanted it simply to remain as a sport, as a pastime, I guess, something you could do that wasn't serious in that regard. So he's been booed since 2013, and the booing has really increased this year. And it got to a point this year where all sorts of things happened. Now, at one point, he actually responded to the people booing him, people from another team, and it's supporters from multiple other teams who really dislike him. Lots of people from lots of other teams. At one point, he did an Aboriginal war dance and then threw an imaginary spear at those people in the crowd. And of course you can imagine that provoked them even more. So it got to the point where the booing was so full on and just relentless every match that he reacted to it and the media reacted to it. So you can see where this is going. Now, of course, a lot of people said it was racist. That said, supposedly there are 71 Aboriginal players in the league out of a few hundred players, and he's the only one who has received this treatment. So, it seems a bit dubious to suggest that it's racist. Why wouldn't they have done it to other people? I'm not sure. But nevertheless, people said it was racist. Now, I actually wish that I had chronicled this whole thing in a kind of day-by-day analysis or record of this, because some of the things I'm going to tell you may be out of order. But it was really amazing to watch this all unfold over the course of 1 or 2 weeks. It really came to a head just after I came to Australia to visit my family. So I sort of saw the whole thing really unfold. And I didn't know anything about this beforehand. I didn't know anything about him. I'm not interested in the AFL, actually. I'm quite unusual in Australia in that I'm not into sport, or at least watching sport. But nevertheless, it was very interesting to me to see how the Cathedral operated on this. And I think because I am not interested in the AFL, it allowed me to not be emotionally invested in the whole affair, and I could view it from afar. But it was really amazing to watch. I had a feeling that was half of complete disgust at the whole way this unfolded, and half just really awestruck by how the Cathedral operated. Almost a sort of an admiration for an enemy in just how incredibly coordinated and so on they were. So what happened is the narrative began with a few prominent media outlets, particularly the ABC. And the ABC, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, they are the state broadcaster. So you could think of them as being analogous to the BBC in the UK, for instance. The ABC in particular, and also another government outlet called SBS, which is sort of an ethnic channel, they really got behind him on all of this, and they started declaring that it's racist. And other people initially stayed out, or they hedged their bets and said, well, we don't know, maybe some of it is, but we don't know if that's the case with everyone. But within a few days, I noticed on all of the other channels, the commercial networks as well, everyone got behind the narrative. It was really amazing to watch on a whole lot of different television programs. Everyone just getting behind this narrative that these were racists, singling him out. Now, of course, there were some people who were opposed to it in the media. They were the usual predictable voices who were sort of reactionary or considered to be fringe in some way or another. But basically the entire media got behind this narrative of him being bullied and by these racists in the crowd. So then he actually took time off to assess his future, and he said he was thinking about not even finishing the season, the playing season, and maybe even, or if not that, then at least leaving at the end of the season, and so on and so forth. So he took time off to assess his future. He missed a match, and he wasn't training and so on. Now I watched an interview or a sort of discussion on the ABC, which is it's very left wing, obviously. That was absolutely ridiculous. At the same time that all of this was going on, there was a big scandal about the Speaker of the House, who the Speaker of the House is actually from a political party in Parliament, in the lower house of Parliament, so that's sort of analogous to Congress in the US. the Speaker of the House is actually from the governing party usually, and but they're supposed to step back from being partisan. Now, the Speaker of the House was a woman called Bronwyn Bishop, and she had been involved in a scandal where she had she had chartered a helicopter to attend an event that she shouldn't have done it for that purpose, because it wasn't anything to do with government business, and she was hated. She was very hated by the opposition and so on. So at the same time that this whole Adam Goodes affair was going on, there was this big hoo-ha about how she had misused funds and so on. So in this interview, they were discussing both of these issues, and some Cathedral hack made a comment where she said she wouldn't be surprised, and I think it was either a Thursday night or a Friday night, and she said she wouldn't be surprised if by the end of the weekend Bronwyn Bishop still had her job and Adam Goodes didn't have his, and that was obviously the wrong way around, basically. And I was watching this with my father at the time, and he was all outraged. I actually started laughing because it was so ridiculous to think that it was going to turn out that way. I mean, it was obvious to me that Bronwyn Bishop was eventually going to be pressured out of being Speaker of the House. She was going to have to resign that position, and that Adam Goodes there was going to be a whole lot of support, and he was going to come back and thank them all for his support and so on and so forth. Now, of course, it doesn't take a genius to guess that that's exactly what happened. I mean, it didn't happen all on the weekend. It took, I think it was until the Monday or the Tuesday, I think it was the Tuesday, after that weekend, for Bronwyn Bishop to be pressured to resign. I think she was pushed by the Prime Minister, though the last thing I heard was she's still in the Parliament. She's just not the Speaker now. Of course, people were pushing for her to leave completely, and she actually didn't break any laws, as far as I know. But all these people were literally calling for her head. And of course, Adam Goodes was back at training by midweek, and I don't know if he's playing this coming weekend, but he was back at training and thanking everyone for their support and so on. So here's what happened. All of the other clubs issued statements of support for him. And then on the weekend, he missed the match on that weekend, but people from other clubs wore their Indigenous uniforms. Their top, there's supposedly an Indigenous round. I don't really know exactly because I'm not into the AFL, but there's a round, something to do with Indigenous people, Aborigines, and every team wears a slightly different top to normal, and for that round of matches. And so they all wore, or not all of them, but several clubs wore their Indigenous tops for last weekend's matches as a show of solidarity and so on. And then at one point, the supporters, each team has these sort of hardcore fans, and those supporters for the Sydney Swans, the team for which Adam Goodes plays, they threatened to smuggle in eggs and throw them at anyone who booed him. And someone who's fairly prominent in football commentary and he used to be sort of involved in management and so on, he said, that would start a riot, and it would. I mean, you can imagine what would happen if someone threw some eggs at someone else and hit them. You can imagine that could get really out of hand. But it remains to be seen whether this is actually going to happen or not. And something else that I saw that was just, I was just laughing at this because it was so ridiculous. They were interviewing different people going to different matches on the weekend about this whole thing, and various people were saying, I support Adam Goodes and all of this. They didn't really show anyone who disagreed, or at least they might have showed one person, I think, but no, I can't remember exactly. Maybe they did, but no one who was really sort of very articulate anyway. But then at one point they interviewed different children at matches out in the countryside, rural matches. And first they they had a kid who was about 6 or 7 who sort of waxed poetic about being anti-racist. And then they had another kid who was about, I think it was about 11. And I think he said something along the lines of, we need to have a conversation about race, or something like that. One of those standard catchphrases that they always use. I really wish I'd written a diary of all this, because it was absurd the way all of this happened. And I was just laughing when this kid, he was talking like he was in a sociology department at a university or something. I thought, what the hell, where's this kid getting this from, right? I mean, the whole thing was just the Cathedral had just kicked into overdrive in this whole thing, and parents, all these people jumping on board, to show that they're really, they're the good guys, they've got the right opinions. It was ridiculous. Some kid out in the middle of nowhere in Australia, an 11-year-old kid talking about how we need to have a conversation about race or something. It was just absurd. And then there were other people who said that, look, this is having a major psychological effect upon Adam Goodes. And, maybe we should just people should stop bullying him for whatever reason, whether it's racist or not, just stop bullying him. I do sort of understand where they're coming from with that. I don't think I would boo him. I think it's a bit crass to harass people, whether it's with racist or non-racist taunts or for whatever reason. That said, he has severely provoked and antagonised other people, and there is something in Australian sport that people will look for any kind of opening, and it's called sledging, where they sort of try to taunt you in any way they can. People from another team will try to get any kind of angle, and if they can put one of the best players on the opposing team off his game, then of course they're going to try to do that so that their team can win. And that's pretty well accepted in Australian sport, that people do that. Maybe not quite to the extent that it's occurred with Adam Goodes, but he has been a very divisive figure, and especially because he's meant to be the Australian of the Year, and that's meant to be something that brings everyone together, but he's been very divisive, and he's brought politics into sport. So I can understand why he's made a lot of people upset, and why they would boo him for that. So, other people, politicians, for instance, they get a lot of flack, and they have to see cartoons and all sorts of commentary and people saying, I hate this guy, for whatever reason. Other people who are in the public spotlight deal with this kind of thing all the time. And, some commentators have said, he basically needs to harden up. But of course that's not going to happen, right? I mean, everyone's got behind him. That's the whole narrative. Now, the narrative, as it always happens with the Cathedral, was grossly out of line with the general opinion within the populace. Some people were completely behind him. Some people were completely opposed to him. Other people were in the middle, of course. But the Cathedral narrative is always way out to one end, and very unrepresentative of the opinions out there. And as I said, there were some people in the media who did criticise him, but they tended to be people who were either known for being extremely right-wing, or at least, what passes for being extremely right-wing within the Overton window, or they were sort of sporting or exporting figures who were known to be sort of troublemakers or people who would say or do silly things. But everyone else was pretty much behind the narrative. Now, of course, this whole issue hasn't been resolved because he's yet to play again, so it will be interesting to see what happens when he comes back to his next match. I mean, obviously, there'll be lots of support for him. It will be interesting to see if anyone boos him. As far as I know, that's actually not against the rules. They haven't changed any rules, as far as I know, about booing him. But nevertheless, I think there'll be enormous social pressure. I mean, anyone who boos, they'll have that person's face all over TV, and that person knows that there'll be repercussions, basically. This is the thing about the Cathedral. It won't even necessarily have to get these people thrown out of football matches. Those people, they'll have their faces all over the media, and everyone in their lives will give them hell about it. They could lose their jobs, all sorts of stuff. The usual way it works. I mean, it will be interesting to see whether people throw eggs at them or not. But basically, I suspect that there'll be hardly anyone, if anyone at all, who will actually boo him from this point on. I think the Cathedral will have achieved its objective here, and sort of advanced the narrative, basically. Now, it was really interesting for me to observe not only the actual event, but other people's reactions to it, or episode rather than event, because, as I said, I'm not interested in the football at all. It's not something I've ever been interested in, and so I didn't have a horse in that race, so to speak. I didn't have a vested interest in it as such. But it was interesting to see the Cathedral really kick into overdrive, and it was interesting to see the predictable responses to that, and how they were doomed to fail, of course. But it was also interesting to observe my father's reaction to all of this, because he's also not really into football, but he's sort of an interesting character. I think he's a bit of a conservative in some ways. And he's a bit, he's very reactive. He sort of, these things happen and they sort of blindside him a little bit. And then he's like, oh my God, what's going on? These people, they're so unreasonable, right? But he doesn't fully understand that that's exactly how it's going to happen every time. That's the Cathedral. He's not sort of really aware of the Cathedral and exactly how it works. And he gets really upset about these things. So it's very interesting to watch his frustrations. Every day he'd come in with the newspaper and say, oh, someone said this or done this, or can you believe they're doing this now? Or we'd be watching TV and he, oh my God, can you believe that person just said that? So it was very interesting to watch his frustration and his sort of impotent rage at the whole episode. And I think in the past, even though I haven't ever been into football, I would have reacted the same way to some extent. I mean, I would have felt like it was a great affront to me somehow that this had all happened. But because I've been into the near reaction for a few years, and I've sort of studied this and seen it happen to other people and so on and so forth, particularly this year with a lot of things that have happened in the US, like the Confederate flag and gay marriage and all of these other issues, it was very interesting to me, and I could sort of distance myself from it, and I could predict, okay, they're going to do this, and no, it's not going to work out that way, but you're saying it that way because that's part of advancing the narrative, like that woman with the interview. All of this stuff, it just unfolded exactly as I knew it would unfold, and it was, as I said, it was almost beautiful the way it unfolded, even though it was kind of evil. It was really beautiful watching it unfold because it was just masterful the whole way it occurred. So, as I said right at the start, this is not something that people would necessarily be interested in at face value, but it's just another way in which the Cathedral has kicked into overdrive on any of these issues. It doesn't matter where these things happen; they always happen the same way. With the Cathedral, how it just kicks into overdrive like this and follows a particular narrative, and the way it shuts down dissent and so on and so forth. So this is actually going to lead into another talk, the next talk I'm going to produce, which is really that we need to build alternate institutions, and we need to get better at hiding in plain sight, because all of these things are going to be big targets for the Cathedral. We can't have our own things, our own spaces, if they're out in the open, if they're obvious. They're going to be big targets. So the next talk is going to be about the need to build these alternate institutions and the need to hide in plain sight. So I hope this has been interesting to you. Thanks for listening.